Okay, I think we're ready. Welcome to the Overby Center. This afternoon we have each side of the charter school issue in the legislature represented. It's been one of the hottest issues I've seen in the legislature in a number of years. The debate in the House, I think, took, someone told me, 10 hours. There are no limit to the number of opinions in this state on education, and you can multiply that by about 100 or 200 when it comes to the charter issue. It's very interesting what's going on. And we have with us this afternoon Senator Bryan from Amory. He's been in the Senate since 1984. He's a Democrat, went to Mississippi State University, but finally came clean and got his law degree from the University of Virginia. And he is an attorney and chairs the Judiciary B Committee. He was one of the primary authors of the Mississippi Adequate Education Program and a longtime advocate for public education in Mississippi. And we have Rachel Canter from Jackson. She is a native of Starkville. I'm seeing something consistent here. She graduated from the University of Pennsylvania and then went for a master's in public policy, I bet, from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She's worked for the Mississippi Commission for Volunteer Service, taught 2 years for Teach for America in the Mississippi Delta, and worked for the Chicago Public Schools, the Education Trust, and the Mississippi Governor's Office. So without any further ado, we'll get to our panel. And I thought I'd start by asking each of you your basic position. Why do we need charter schools in Mississippi?
Sure. So Mississippi First supports charter schools because we want to make sure that every child has an excellent public school to attend. Too many children in Mississippi today go to underperforming schools. Too many children, even in schools that are considered okay, are not having their needs met. Charter schools in other parts of the country have shown us that there are different ways to educate kids in public schools. And they have shown us that all children can learn, that low-income children can achieve as much as high-income children, that black students can achieve as much as white students, and that we can close the achievement gap if we structure our schools in such a way to provide kids the resources that they need at their school. So we support charter schools as an effort to do schooling better for every child.
Okay. And Senator Bryan, why should we stay away from charter schools?
Where are you from? You from here? We had to tell her where we're from. You from Oxford?
I'm from Shelby, Mississippi.
You're from Shelby.
By way of Miami, Florida, and now in Oxford.
Missed your turn.
I did.
How many people remember the Little 10 Conference? A show of hands. This is sad. Oh, thank you. The Little 10 Conference. Amory, Aberdeen, Pontotoc, New Albany, Oxford, Bruce, West Point, sometimes W and Y. This is a group of schools which actually had 10 members, which of course nowadays is not a requirement, that were all located in small towns in northeast Mississippi. And really, in addition to being an athletic conference, it was sort of had some academic overtones. There were gatherings of Little 10, this, that, or other, but basically it was small towns in and about, though not including Tupelo. In 1961, it's the first time I remember being in Oxford, because Amory and Oxford were playing here for what was obviously going to determine the championship of the Little 10 Conference. Wasn't the last game, but it was clearly the championship. So folks from Amory came over here. In the first half, Oxford scored, missed an extra point, went into halftime 6-0. In the second half, Amory scored and made the extra point, so we won the game 7-6, and we were Little 10 champions in 1961. I remember after that game, we were getting ready to go home, and I'd come over with a friend of mine, and these people from Oxford were crying. There were cheerleaders that were crying, and I remember that. I'm too young, but I remember it. It made an impression on me. And I felt sorry for the cheerleaders that were crying. And my friend remarked, "I'm glad we beat them, we made them cry." I grew up to be a Democrat, he grew up to be a Republican. But that, of course, was a time when schools were segregated. All those towns now have what, back in the phraseology of the time, was a unified school district. And now, in most of those towns that made up the Little Ten Conference, which is sort of where I'm coming from and where I think most cities in Mississippi are, there's one school district in town, one school in town. Everybody goes to the same school. All the people with lots of money, all the people with no money, everybody in between. Black students, white students. There's some students that go elsewhere, but basically everybody in town attends the same school. And basically those are pretty good schools in those communities. Some of them are really good schools. It's an incredible community building event, entity. There's not much we all have in common anymore. It's, apparently there are more than 3 networks now, who knows. But people listen to their own TV channels, they listen to their own radio channels, they go to these internet things, they go to their own little places. We all need to come together as a community. And the public schools do that for us. That's in the best long-term interest of the children that are in the public schools now. It's in the best long-term interest of the children that are in the public schools in the future. So I think that's the model of a public school that we have in most places in Northeast Mississippi. And I think that's the appropriate model. When there are talks about charter schools, it's almost as though the words charter schools are a talisman, because I keep asking over and over again, what is it about a charter school? What are the features of a charter school that make it better than other schools? I can't get an answer to that. In fact, there was a fairly lengthy exchange between me and one of my colleagues, and he said he wanted a certain school, I think it was their alternative school. He wanted it to be a charter school. And I said, well, why? I was thinking it ought to be a charter school. Well, what would change? What do you want to do about a charter school? I can't get an answer.
I'd love to answer you, Hob.
Okay.
Well, there are a lot of things that make charter schools different than traditional public schools. We know that in many traditional public schools, we've been doing education the same way that we have done it before the 50s, forever. We haven't really innovated around the way that we provide education. You've got 25 students to a class, you have one teacher, they have so many periods a day, so many days a year, and then they go home. Charter schools, because they have flexibility from some state laws and policies, are able to design different kinds of school experiences for children. Some charter schools still have 25 students to a class, but they have a longer school day, they might have a different type of curriculum, they might have more project-based learning, they might pay their teachers more, they might require their teachers to show that they're moving their students along a continuum of success in order to stay in the school. There was a recent study that came out of Harvard University by Roland Fryer, who many people know because he helped write the book Freakonomics with Stephen Levitt. That study identified 5 practices of high-performing charter schools that made them different and unique and made them successful. Those 5 practices included things like frequent teacher feedback, things like data-driven instruction, a relentless focus on student achievement. These are the kinds of practices that were consistent across those high-performing charter schools in Boston. What they have done now, which is the really interesting thing about this study, is they've taken those practices and they're trying to implement them in traditional public schools in Houston right now in a project called Apollo 20. So they've taken 20 low-performing schools in Houston and they're introducing these practices to see if they can translate what they've learned from these high-performing charters into other schools. Charter schools are not magic. if anybody tries to tell you charter schools are magic and they're going to solve all our problems, then they're either lying to you or they're extremely naive. The fact of the matter is that education is a complicated business. It's complicated for everyone involved, from teachers and students and families and administrators. Charter schools are not going to be the answer for everybody. But where we have seen successful, high-performing charter schools, we've seen a different type of thinking about a lot of different things, about the way that resources are allocated, about the way that teachers are chosen, trained, retained, paid, evaluated. These are the kinds of conversations that are now being driven in the national education community because we have these examples of success in high-performing charter schools across the country. Of course, there are charter schools that are not high-performing. There are certainly charter schools that have not lived up to the bargain that we will give you more flexibility in exchange for more accountability. And frankly, we need to close those charter schools. That's why we have to have a state law that is very careful and that is going to hold that high bar on accountability. The fact of the matter is, education in Mississippi and in America does not work for too many kids. And we can sit here and dream about what we should do better, or we could do it. And charter schools have shown us that some people in some schools in some states are doing it different and better. And I don't think that we can ignore that and stick our heads under the sand and say, you know, we'll just wait until the traditional public schools do something differently. I think we have to have models of success. We have some of those models already in traditional public education. We do not have enough in this state. And the vitality and the energy and the passion and the intelligence and the talent that the charter sector has brought to other states that has then bled into the traditional system in other states is something that we need here.
Admittedly, there's some successful, high-performing charter schools. There's some successful, high-performing public schools. I guess what we should have done is get up a bus ride and taken a crowd of people to Fairfax County, Virginia, and Montgomery County, Maryland, and let them see what a public school can do when it's got enough money to operate on. And then they would have all come back with starry eyes because they'd seen public schools in Montgomery County, Maryland, and Fairfax County, Virginia. There is no reason that I know of that stands in the way of any public school in the state of Mississippi of adopting any of the matters that were or characteristics of high-performing or successful charter schools. And one of the questions I keep asking over and over is, why will one of the charter school operators not take on an entire district? They won't do it. There are a number of schools under conservatorship. The State Department of Education has unlimited just about discretion with what to do with them. If they need any more discretion, we'll let them have it. But so far as I know, no charter school will take an entire district. If you'll let me get and any school person knows this, if you'll let me get a group of students and I can dismiss the students that are troublesome, and I'll get a select group of teachers, well, I can come out on that. One of the great ironies is that by definition, the charter schools need the public schools to send the children that they don't want to have. I don't understand why they won't take on an entire district. I asked this question once and I was told, well, that's a recipe for failure. Well, why? You may have heard all the turmoil about dropouts, and you know, it really is a major time to beat up on public schools. I've never seen anything like it. There's just a complete, total attack on public schools coming from all corners. And one of the attacks is you're not taking care of all these dropouts. Well, the charter schools solve the dropout problem in two ways. First of all, they don't let them drop in the first place. And secondly, they have the public schools to send the students that don't comply with the rules and the contracts and everything. We've decided some time ago that as a matter of state policy, all students must be educated. And if it's more difficult to educate some students than others, we just have to work at it harder. But all students can learn, and all students must be educated. And it is the duty of the public school in each area to do that. And so we've been holding the public schools accountable for doing that. The charter schools don't have that responsibility. Then there's the discussion of all these rules. There are all these terrible rules and regulations, and I have asked till I'm blue in the face. Would you tell me what are these rules and regulations that we need to free up the public schools from? Well, they're just all these regulations. I never get specific answers. But ironically, the same crowd that wants to free up the public schools from all these regulations, all day, every day, has a new set of regulations that apply to public schools but not charter schools. For example, last session there was a proposal pushed by the casinos, of course, to not allow schools to start before the third Monday in August or whatever it was. Well, it seems to me that the local school boards can figure out what time they want their schools to start. But no, nothing would do. But that we passed this law in Jackson which says the schools have to start no earlier than the third Monday in August. And of course, I was tacky enough to ask the question, well, does this apply to charter schools? Well, no, it doesn't apply to charter schools. There have been other legislation that's passed. I think some of the legislation has a good bit to recommend it. We passed a bill just a couple of days ago about tests in the third grade and about social promotion beyond the third grade if you haven't mastered such reading skills and all that. I tend to think that's probably a good rule. But again, that's another regulation from the state that we're putting on the local schools, but yet the same crowd says we've got to do away with all these regulations. From what I know about listening to people talk about education and what works, there's a lot to be said for longer school days and a lot to be said for longer school years. I'm told by people who I think know what they're talking about that one of the problems we have is that the summer break, particularly for students who don't have really good environments during that break, is very detrimental, and that students tend to forget what they've learned, and they don't have as enriched a life as they would if they were attending public school. Why don't we talk about extending the school year? Why don't we try to encourage innovation in the public schools?
So I have a variety of responses to a variety of things that Senator Bryan said. I'll start with charter schools or public schools. That means that if you support charter schools, you support public schools. You can also support traditional public schools and support charter schools at the same time. That does not make you incoherent in terms of your beliefs. I know because I support both traditional public schools and charter schools. Not every child is going to go to a charter school. We have to do something about low-performing traditional public schools at the same time. That doesn't mean we can't have charter schools. There are a lot of people who have said that, well, charter schools, cream or they push out. So creaming being the idea that they only take the good students, and the push out idea being that, well, they get rid of the bad students and that's how they show results. There's research on both of these topics. The study that was done on creaming that is most cited was done by the RAND Corporation. It was a study of 8 states. It found absolutely no evidence that charter schools cream students. In fact, it found evidence that students who go to charter schools tend to have lower academic achievement than the students from the schools that they came from. If you think about this, it makes sense. It is a big deal to a parent to take their child out of one school and put their child into another school. They have to learn new teachers, they have to learn a new system, they have a whole different group of friends, it's in an unfamiliar place. Parents have to be pretty dissatisfied about the education their child is receiving in one school in order to uproot them and put them in another school. And the parents who are most dissatisfied are parents whose children are not doing well in the school that they're in. So it's completely rational to see why they found that in the 8 states that they studied. The push-out question is another one that has been raised repeatedly. There's no systemic evidence that push-out happens in charter schools and that explains results. Many of the studies on this have been about the KIPP charter network. It's the most studied charter network in the country. There have been a variety of bad studies on this question, and then a variety of responses to those bad studies. And where people come down in the research community is that there is attrition at KIPP, meaning there are some students that leave and some students that don't leave. In high poverty schools, there is a lot of student mobility in general because kids are housing unstable when they're high poverty. They move in and out of school. That is common. So the real question is, does KIPP have greater attrition than similar high poverty schools? And the answer is no. The fact is that of the children that leave KIPP, they do not explain the response that KIPP gets. They do not explain the achievement that KIPP gets. Certainly you can find stories of people behaving badly. That is why you have to have a very strong accountability framework in a charter school, because you've got to make sure that the charter school authorizer is following these things. In the 2 bills that have been passed by the House and the Senate, both bills require charter schools to annually report their suspension and expulsion rates, as well as their year-to-year enrollment. So if there is a school that is pushing out large numbers of kids, it will be completely transparent for all the world to see, because that data will be reported. I think another issue that is frequently brought up, or that Senator Bryan brought up, was about why don't charter schools take over an entire district? There are some charter school operators that take over schools. Many charter school operators, about 90% of charter schools in the nation, start new schools. They have a model that works, it's successful for their students, and so they start new schools. But there are well-known charter school operators that do what are called school turnarounds or conversion schools. Typically, they don't take over an entire district. Typically, they take over a school and then they build. They might even take over a grade and then add a grade every year until they've taken over the entire school. I don't know who the Mississippi Department of Education has talked to about this. If they talk to a charter school operator that only does new schools, it makes sense to me why they would have gotten a response of, we won't do that. But there are plenty of charter school operators like Green Dot, like the Academy of Urban School Leadership, that do this nationally and have been successful at it. It's a much more specialized type of school reform than a New Start school is. Typically, a charter would come in and take over parts of the district at the time, but you have to recognize also that charter schools are schools of choice. You cannot force a child to go to a charter school. So even if you tried to charterize an entire district, you would still have to have a second option for parents, because you cannot force a parent to send their child to a charter school.
Why not?
Because that's the way that the laws are written.
If the
They're
charter
schools of
school
choice.
is, if the public school, and by the way, this comment about charter schools or public schools, the one thing that's public about a charter school is that name. Yeah, other than that, there's nothing public
But they have
about
to
it.
take any child that wants to come. There are no admissions requirements. There's no other test for a child to get in. Any child that comes can go to a charter school if they're in the grade of the school that is offered.
And your first description of how children get to charter schools is the parents are concerned about the children, so the parents take their children to the charter schools. So the first thing you've got is a concerned parent. Anybody who's taught school knows that the children with the parents who are concerned enough to go through this process are leaps and bounds ahead of the students who don't.
Well, I would like to respond to that, though, because I have taught school. I have taught school. And I had students every year. I taught in a low-income school. 99% was low income. Their parents might not have come to every PTA meeting, but they cared about their children. And they did not come to PTA meetings because they were not at a good time for their parent. But you better bet your bottom dollar that if that parent thought their child was being mistreated, they were going to do something about it. And so I think that the issue is that sometimes we don't give parents enough credit. Certainly there are parents that will not go down to a place and sign their child up for a school. But when you look at parents that are desperate to get their children out of a failing school, they will go miles for them. I don't think it's fair for us to sit there and say that parents, only parents who go to charter schools are exceptional or different because they're concerned, when 98% of parents, in my experience, are concerned about their child and they're concerned about the education that their children get.
If charter
I
schools,
think you're making my point, but okay.
if charter schools or public schools, won't they bleed money away from already failing public schools?
So this is a question
Or all
that we get a
public
lot.
schools.
Yeah, this is a question that charters get a lot because the money that funds charter school students is the same money that would fund that child if they went to the traditional public school. Certainly, depending on where you put a charter, that will have a differential impact. If you put a charter school in Jackson, Mississippi, for example, and that charter school serves 100 students, that's going to have a different impact on Jackson Public Schools than if you put a charter school serving 100 students in Benoit that has a school district with 300 children. We can all talk about whether or not it's a good idea to have school districts that serve only 300 children. That's a separate question. But I think that the issue is that before a charter school is approved by the authorizer, we are going to know where it will be located and how many students it will serve. Now, the House bill has a weird provision that charter school students have to only come from the district in which the charter is located. That would make it very hard to place charters in rural areas because then the charter school would be pulling from a very small rural district, small in terms of population, and the impact would be felt entirely in that one district rather than spread out across multiple districts. Certainly, there are more examples of urban charter schools than rural schools, and part of this is a question because of the way that charter schools that have that impact. But I think the thing that we have to remember is A, we are going to know what this impact will be before a decision is made, and B, at the end of the day, it's about educating children. And if we say we want to educate children and we want to educate all children, then we cannot do something in a charter school sector that will damage or disrupt the education that children in the other school are getting. And we have to make the decisions that are best. If it is best for the children in that community to have a second option for public schools, we have to weigh that as heavily as we would the fiscal impact on the traditional public school. I think we can all agree that you need money for excellent schools. You cannot run schools off fumes. At the same time, I hope we can all agree we have not always used our money well in traditional public education, and we need to have a much wider conversation about the allocation of school resources and how best to use school dollars to get achievement. We have budgets that we've always had, things that we've always done it the way we have. And I think we're going to have to start thinking very differently. Over time, school expenditures go up, state revenues go down. We are sort of on a collision course here for all public schools in Mississippi in terms of how much money they get per child. And if we don't think about how to change our cost structure and how to rethink that allocation, we're all going to be in trouble whether or not there is ever a charter school in the same district as another traditional public school.
Where to start? Rick Santorum used to be in the Senate, United States Senate. He got elected to Congress. When Rick Santorum ran for Congress, one of his main arguments was the incumbent congressman is living in Washington, he's not living in the district. So Rick Santorum got elected to Congress and then to the United States Senate, whereupon he moved his family to suburban Virginia. Said, oh, that's different, this is the Senate, it's not the House, it's two entirely different things. He enrolled his children, who were living in suburban Virginia, in a virtual school out there in the ether, and tens of thousands of dollars from the school district where Rick Santorum maintained a residence went to the virtual charter school. That's what they're driving for in Mississippi, is the same thing. When I pay taxes to the Amory Public School, I'm paying taxes to the Amory Public School. Under this plan, if you can find a child who resides in the Amory Public School district and enroll them in a charter school, or enroll them in a virtual school under the bill as it was originally introduced, then that pro rata share of the money from Amory High School goes there. They'll be taking tax money that I pay to the Amory Public Schools the tax millage rate of which is determined by people in Amory. And that money will go to some charter school or to some virtual school or wherever. I have enormous concern about doing that, and I think ultimately that's not good for the public schools in our communities. I should say, I think there's one major difference here, and it's why I started out talking about the Little 10 schools. There's a major difference, in my opinion, in a metropolitan school district and the typical school district that we have in Mississippi. In a metropolitan district, there are multiple high schools. There's a certain amount of choosing school A versus school B that goes on, or certainly can go on. And I'm not here to talk about what are the appropriate rules for a large metropolitan district. That's not my area of expertise. But I think I've got a pretty good handle on the school districts in this part of the state. And I think the model that I described is what's in the best interest of all the students and what's in the best interest of the community.
So there is a fear, at least there used to be a fear in the Delta among black legislators in particular, that if charter schools came into being, y'all have all heard this, that they would prove to be a Trojan horse of sorts for all white or nearly all white academies, and give them a way to get public funds, or for them perhaps to disband and reemerge as a charter school, and most of those students just kind of slide on over there. What guarantees are there in the legislation that's now from the two houses and residing in the conference committee? What guarantee is there that that won't happen?
Well, it's not in conference just yet, so there's still hope.
Before we answer that question then, what's the status of the bill? Both houses have passed it.
Yes.
Both houses have passed different bills. The House has passed a House bill, the Senate's passed a Senate bill, but neither house has taken up the other's bill.
Okay.
So we're only like halfway through.
Okay, so each house has got to take up each other's bill
Right.
Or at least one house has to take up the other house's
before
bill.
it goes to a conference committee. All right.
But they're probably discussing that in the secret meetings they have.
Well,
So-
yeah. I can't speak about secret meetings, but I can answer your question about what's in the legislation. So in the Senate legislation, there's a provision that says that 80% of students in a charter school have to be have the same at-risk demographics as children who are in the traditional public school. So they call it underserved children. And in the Senate bill, there are 4 categories of underserved. In the House bill, there are 2 categories of underserved. So in the Senate bill, it says you are deemed an underserved child if you have low academic proficiency, so you're not proficient on state exams. You have an IEP, which means you're a student receiving special education services. You are a student who is an English language learner, or you are a low-income student. If you know anything about school research, you know that many of those categories are highly, highly correlated, especially in Mississippi. If you look at the demographics or the research or whatever of a school in Mississippi, pick any school, and you'll see that a very similar percentage of low-income children is also like the similar percentage to students who are not proficient, students who might be English language learners are often also low income, often also not proficient. So what the Senate bill says is that you have to take this population, whatever it is, whether it's 40% in the traditional public school, 60%, 100%, the charter school has to match those demographics at least 80%, to a level of at least 80% of the percent that's in traditional public schools. If they don't, they can have their charter revoked if there is a finding that there was discrimination. Charters, the way that they work, they cannot have admissions tests. They cannot tell special education students receiving special education that they cannot go to a charter school. Any child that signs up is allowed to go. I think that in the past there has been a fear that this is just a backdoor way to turn what are currently private schools in Mississippi into charter schools or into schools that can then get public money. We've also added in the legislation in both the House and the Senate a prohibition outright on private school conversions. There's also a prohibition in the Senate bill on new schools started by private school groups. In the application process, you have to outline who is involved in the application. So this is all information that will go into the authoriser's decision-making process, and then once a school is formed, will go into the oversight and monitoring process. Certainly, it is a huge concern and a huge fear because we have a history here in Mississippi where we've tried to deny children their rights to an education based on their skin color, based on other factors. I think that when you look at charter schools across the country, charter school students are predominantly low income, they're predominantly black, and they're predominantly brown. They do not look like the people who sit in this audience. They look like black and brown kids and low-income kids. Why? Because those are the kids who are not being served well in our traditional public schools right now, especially here in Mississippi. We need communities to give a serious look at charter schools. Charters work best when they are community-driven schools. 70% of charter schools across America are not CMOs, which are networks of charters, national networks of charter schools. They're actually locally driven affairs. They're independent schools designed and built for the specific community that they serve. We are likely to have a charter school sector that mirrors that of the rest of the nation. We're likely to have community-driven schools. We will probably also have some CMOs. But I think that all of us that are following this legislation in terms of working on it and fighting for it, and certainly Mississippi First, once the bill, if it is passed and begins, we will follow it to implementation. And there's always got to be constant vigilance whenever you pass something that's this huge. I just think that we have to recognize that we are in a different place in our history right now than we were 40 years ago. 40 years ago, the fight was about getting rid of legal segregation, making everybody be able to have access to the same thing. We've done that. It has not always worked as well as we wanted to. But now what I think the fight is about the fact that every child has, a teacher in a school building, et cetera, but every child is still not getting an equal education. And so those folks that have answered the call in the charter sector that have done it really well have done it specifically for this reason. They're mission-driven. They want to serve kids who are not being served well. I don't think that there's a perfect answer. People are always going to be frightened, especially now because there's so many unknowns in terms of we don't know where charter schools are going to pop up. But these are things we're going to know before we have to make a decision about where a school goes. These are things that we will know as we get into the process. And, trust me is not a good answer, but I think that there's enough.
But we will know. We will know, as you said.
But we will know,
We will know. I want to make it clear that when I'm talking about the selection process that in fact takes place for charter schools, it has nothing to do with race. It has nothing to do with economic status. It has to do with the children that are in the background, the children without parents who are involved. Maybe 98% of the children in the school where you were had parents that were keenly involved in their education. I'm not sure that's the case across the board. I think there are plenty of children with missing parents in the state of Mississippi. But since we mentioned who it is that's going to be running these schools, one of the largest groups running charter schools is, of course, from Turkey. And I think there's been on 60 Minutes stories about this. And so in Texas, there are large numbers of charter schools run by this outfit from Turkey. And, I'm glad the people in Turkey are so concerned about the education of students in the United States. I just wonder what's really going on there. But if you show up and click off the box and get the children to sign up, you get your money. And I find that disturbing.
So what Senator Bryan is referring to is the Harmony Public Schools in Texas. They have a connection to a Turkish Turkish group of folks who have started these math and science schools in Texas. They're very successful schools in terms of academic achievement, which is why so many parents send their children to the Harmony Public Schools. There has been people implying that these schools are going to be secret madrasas that are going to come in and steal your children and indoctrinate them. I think that's pretty silly. Certainly there has been some evidence that perhaps these schools are contracting with other Turkish entities exclusively, and that looks kind of shady. And certainly we need to have an authorizer in Mississippi that would look out for those things. This whole conversation led to the House putting in some interesting language in their version of the bill that would prevent any foreign nationals from being involved with charter school applications or from the authorizer approving any charter schools that had anything to do with foreign groups. They also prohibit, in the House bill, foreign nationals on visas from teaching in charter schools unless there are no ordinary Mississippians, I guess, who could teach in those schools. People felt in the House they needed to have this language in the bill for it to pass. Fact of the matter is that the Harmony Public Schools, they are a CMO in Texas. We have no idea if they'd want to come here. They're not the majority of charter public schools in the country. And certainly if there were shady contracting practices or any evidence of secret madrasas going on, that I find it hard to believe that Mississippi parents would be signing up to send their children there.
It's just a Texas phenomenon.
Well, I think that the fact of the matter is that at the end of the day, they're good schools in Texas. They're high performing on math and science, and parents who look at their traditional public schools and say, my child is not getting an education here, they're saying they will get an education at Harmony, I'm going to send my child there. And if the parents who send their children there do it for a reason. They're, Texas parents. They're not, people from foreign countries trying to infiltrate the U.S.
In the Delta, which is the poorest, I think, the poorest part of the state. Other parts of the state may disagree. But the schools are particularly challenged there. Anybody who's lived in the Delta for any period of time knows that. Anybody who's worked in the Delta, traveled through the Delta for any period of time knows that. It's been very, very hard through the legislative process, through any other process, to change that in the Delta. In Florida, I'm getting somewhere here. In Florida, the quality of charter schools is notoriously uneven. There's some wonderful charter schools. There's some terrible and sometimes even felonious charter schools. Why can't a piece of legislation be written if we know that the KIPP schools have a great record, and they've certainly done a good job in Helena, Arkansas. I can't dispute that.
I can.
Why? Okay. Why not pass legislation that says we're going to take KIPP charter schools and no other?
So, a variety of reasons. And I would like to say that both the House and the Senate bill, neither of those are based off of Florida's charter school law. They're based off the National Alliance of Public Charter Schools model law, which was written in 2009. They brought together charter school experts from across the country to put in one piece of legislation, all the best practices that they had learned over the previous 20 years of having charter schools everywhere else. Because one phenomenon that you might know about is that many states are now going back to their charter laws and tightening them up on accountability provisions and on authorizing provisions. All of those things have been included in these two bills that are written in Mississippi right now already.
Those sound like state regulations.
Charter schools are not unregulated.
That's what I hear all day, every day in the debate.
Well, unfortunately, people don't always know all the ins and outs of things that they espouse or support. But the charter schools are actually very regulated on some things and not others. So what some people have described this as being tight on ends and loose on means, meaning that charter schools actually have to meet a much higher bar for accountability than traditional public schools do. And if they were to open in Mississippi under both bills, whether the House or Senate bill passes, they have identical language on the performance framework that charter schools would have to meet. In the House bill, they also have the entire Title 37, which is Mississippi's state law for education, and whether or not charter schools are in and out on every last thing. I think that many of the things in Mississippi, charter schools that they would be free from are not necessarily things that make or break schools. The things that are, I think, really key that charter schools get flexibility from in both the House and the Senate side, they get flexibility in terms of teachers, who they can hire, how much they can pay them, under what circumstances they could terminate them, et cetera. That's actually probably the most important provision. There was a language that in both of the House and the Senate about certification of teachers and administrators. That keeps getting tightened and tightened and tightened. And so the bills both started out with a higher flexibility for hiring uncertified people. They all have to be highly qualified under No Child Left Behind, but they don't necessarily have to hold state certification. So right now in both the House and the Senate, there's a 25% flexibility on both. They can hire up to 25% that are not state certified, but then over time they have to become state certified. But 100% of administrators don't have to be certified. The things like having a longer school day or longer school year, it's certainly true that Mississippi's law right now simply says you have to have a minimum of 180 days. It doesn't say you can't have year-round school. But the fact is nobody does it. Why does nobody do it? Because we've always done things one way, and we need someone to come along and show us probably that you can do it a different way. I think that there are a lot of things in this charter bill, even the Senate bill, which is the shorter of the two, is 68 pages. That's a really long piece of legislation. And the House bill is 251 pages. That's because of all the Title 37 that went in the back of it. We could talk about this all day long, about every last thing. And at the end of the day, some people are just never going to believe it, and some people will believe it no matter what you tell them. But I think most Mississippians are probably somewhere in the middle, where you're trying to assess, is this good enough, given everything that we know, that it's something we should take a chance on? And in my opinion, where we've seen high-performing charters in other states, it was well worth that chance that those legislators took, because it can have a profound impact on students who go to high-performing charter schools. And system-wide, we can learn from what those high-performing charter schools do and try to incorporate those practices into traditional public education. That's something that we haven't talked about nearly enough. But, I don't think Senator Bryan and I are ever going to agree on this issue, unfortunately.
Well, you mentioned a while back that the KIPP schools, everyone seemed to think the KIPP schools in Helena were doing well. The public schools are judged by how well the students who reside in that public school district are doing. And it's been a great struggle and a major point to say you have a responsibility for every student in that district. We cannot just take a group of students and put them to one side and forget about them. In Helena, Arkansas, there may be a charter school with a select group of students that is performing well. But again, I raise the issue, what about the students who are left behind? The charter school has no responsibility at all for the students that are over there in the Helena School District that are not performing well. But by definition, the public school does have that responsibility. You mentioned how things were 40 years ago. Since I've been in the legislature, there's been a constant fight, and it's a fight that was going on long before I got there, between the people who basically believed in public education and were fighting for it and the people that were on the other side. The battle for public kindergartens was there before I got there. When I was there were repeated battles for some sort of permissible or some sort of decent pay for teachers, which somehow gets translated into a teacher pay raise, which is a big political thing. But we do need to pay our teachers well enough, and over the years we were constantly fighting to get salaries which might be halfway competitive so that at least people who wanted to teach could do it. There were those battles. There were battles over the compulsory attendance law. For those of us who've been supporting public schools, we've also supported just about every accountability measure that came down the pike almost to the point, I think, of having accountability measures that border on being counterproductive. But we've certainly been in favor of accountability. Several years back, there were 2 issues nationwide about school funding. One of the most well-known was the argument over equity, and just basically schools who live in, or students who live in poverty poor districts have less money per student to operate on than schools in more affluent areas. And so in state after state, including Texas, there were lawsuits brought by students in the poverty poor districts complaining that it was a violation of the state constitution for them to be underfunded. Texas is still trying to deal with those lawsuits. The adequate education formula, which we passed in Mississippi, solved or went a long way toward dealing with that issue. Every school district in the state bought into it, and there's been no question but that formula is an equitable distribution, at least equitable enough to be fair to the districts with less money. At the same time, there was an argument about adequacy, which is regardless of whether the money is divided up equally, are you providing enough money simply to go out and hire the teachers that are required to teach? And so there were the adequacy lawsuits. The funding formula for the first time defined what an adequate education was, determined how much that cost, and hooked up our funding formula to what our accreditation standards were requiring, so that the formula, again by consensus of everybody in the room, every school district in the state, the formula would give each district enough money, more to it than money to be sure, but enough money to provide the education that was required for basic accreditation. We named it the Mississippi Adequate Education Program because of those 2 technical terms, the adequacy lawsuit or the adequacy issue, and the equity lawsuits or the equity issue. Obviously, we should have hired a PR guy to come up with a catchier name, but at any rate, that's what we did. We fought that battle. It was vetoed by Governor Fordyce. We overrode that veto. If you look back over the years of all these fights, those of us who, by the way, were elected with a large help from an organization called Mississippi First, you'll find a group of people pretty much consistently on this side of the education issue, and a group of people over here voting no on everything. I would suggest any of you who have any familiarity with the politics of the Mississippi legislature, just look at the roll call. This is a roll call on education. Look who's voting which way. And overwhelmingly, the people that have been voting no on every public school issue over the past 8 years, endless attempts to keep the Barber administration from making unnecessary cuts to public schools, attempts to restore at least some of the hundreds of millions of dollars that were being cut. We occasionally would pass something, it'd be vetoed by Governor Barber, we couldn't understand it. Look at those roll calls, look at who was looking which way. If you'll compare the charter school roll calls, the people voting yes on charter schools are extraordinarily similar to the no votes from years past. And those of us who've been there fighting the battle for decades are over on the no side of this issue. I'm sorry, I think that ought to tell you something.
It's sad to me that we can't support something that would be great for children in Mississippi because the Republicans support it and the Democrats don't, or because the Democrats support it and the Republicans don't. When nationally there is bipartisan support for charter schools, including in the Obama administration. The fact is that we have to do things differently in education. You know, we talk about charter schools like it's an either-or proposition. Either you like charter schools or you like traditional education. Either you support public schools or you support something else. We support at Mississippi First pre-K. We just had a big day in the Senate yesterday when we passed off the Senate floor our pre-K bill. We also support charter schools. We also support things for school turnaround in traditional public schools. We also support comprehensive sex education in public schools in Mississippi. We support a lot of different things. you can support all of these same things at once. It's not compelling to me to say, choose your opinion based on what the partisan politics look like in the state of Mississippi, when the fact is that the politics nationally look very different on this issue. We have taken a lot of heat from a lot of our public school supporters who don't like our position on charter schools. But we'll continue to take that heat because we think that this is the right thing for students, especially in low-performing schools in Mississippi, who've been low-performing for decades. And when we look and we see other options, it's hard not to say no, even if you have to work with people that you might not agree with on anything else. I just don't think it's a compelling argument to say, some people like public schools, some people don't. Choose your opinion based on that and not have done any further investigation of what the charter sector looks like nationally, what the research says, what high-performing charter schools look like, and who they serve.
That may not mean anything to you, but for those of us who've given our lives to this fight, who've been in the Mississippi legislature year after year, fighting the same people, and I did not inject partisanship into this because I don't think it's a partisan issue. There's not a single piece of good education legislation that was passed since I've been there that was not passed with bipartisan support. I'm not talking about party. I'm talking about the people that have consistently supported public education and the people that have been fighting it tooth and nail ever since I've been there. And it does make a difference.
Okay, how time passes when we're having fun. We have been here for 53, 54 minutes. And I feel like I ought to provide just a few minutes here, just about 5 minutes, to see if there are any questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand and speak loudly.
Rachel, do you support a separate agency being created other than the State Board of Education as the authorizer for the charter school?
Yes, and it's in both bills that way. The reason is that what we've seen nationally is that now there's a trend away from putting charter school authorizing offices in state boards of education because often state boards of education are not organized to do the work of charter schools. It's a very different type of work than state boards of education and state departments of education have typically done. So we have supported the independent authorizer board to do nothing but open, authorize, oversight and close charter schools and to get to be experts at that one job. People come down on either side of this. I know this is a big conversation that some people say they'd feel much more comfortable if it was the State Board of Ed. Some people say they hate the State Board of Ed and they don't want have anything to do with the State Board of Ed, whether or not they like charter schools. It's been interesting to see how people have come down on this. But yes, we support the Independent Authorizing Board. It is in both pieces of legislation. We're likely to see that if a bill passes.
Response real quick, or do you want to respond?
I'll just say they're afraid of the State Department of Education too. I mean, what can you say for the state board?
Yes, sir.
I'm wondering, this is all about choice and a student being able to choose where he or she will go. We are a rural state. Mm-hmm. Now, what choice does a poor student, let's say a farmer or whatever, a poor student in this county, how can he go 3 or 4 counties over to get into a charter school? Does he really have a choice?
Well, if you so charter schools are, the authorizer board won't sit out and put charter schools, decide to put a charter school geographically located everywhere. They have to wait for applications to come to them and then to approve applications. Certainly, if there is a charter school in Bolivar County, and that's the closest charter school to a child in Lafayette County, that's not really a good choice for them because they would have to travel so far, it's not feasible. But I do think the other question that you have to ask is, does the child in Lafayette County want a choice? Are there enough children in Lafayette County that want a choice other than the choice that they've already got, which is the traditional public school? And if there are enough children in Lafayette County that want a different choice because they're not satisfied with the education that Lafayette County is providing them, then that is when you start getting a community-driven charter school together. I don't want people to mistake me in saying that some children in Mississippi don't get a great education at their traditional public schools. Certainly they do. And charters are not right for every child. But when you don't get a good education, you don't have a choice. You have to go there. And unless your parents have means, and they can move you to a place in the state that has strong traditional public schools, and you can buy a house, it's much harder, yeah. If they have money, then people can, right now, people with money right now can choose what communities they live in, what neighborhoods they buy houses in, and children without means don't have that option. They're in the schools that they're in. And what really upsets me sometimes in our conversation is that we don't recognize right now that people with means in the state have choice right now. Because they can take their economic power and they can buy a house in a community where housing stock is expensive, and they can buy a house in a community that has an A or B label on their school district. And if you are a parent in an F school district, chances are you don't have those economic means and you don't have a choice. And I think that charters that we've seen nationally that are high performing and that serve low income children, that's the mission that they have, is to provide children something else, something better than what they're getting right now, because their parents cannot afford to move them somewhere else or cannot afford to send them to a private school if there were even a private school that were worth it in their area.
The people of means in Amory, Mississippi have their children in the Amory public schools, and that is of enormous benefit to the children in Amory whose parents are not people of means. I did want to make one point quickly. It's good to listen to each other, and it's good to have a discussion. One of the things that has come about from all of this is it seems to me there are problems with our conservatorship law. And again, those of us who were there fighting established what was at the time a fairly radical event, that if your school district was failing, that the state would come in and take over that school district. Unfortunately, what we assumed is that almost immediately, as quickly as you could turn that district back over to the community, the better it was. I think in retrospect that's a mistake. That the same, whatever it is, the political situation or whatever, which led to a dysfunctional school is likely to still be there. And turning the school back over quickly to the community probably is not the thing to do. It's difficult to recruit staff and all for a short period of time. Mercy sakes, they have superintendents commuting. I think we would do much better, generally speaking, when the state takes over a school district to look at a 5 or 10-year window to have opportunity to get new people in, get people to live in the town and teach in the school, and on and on. I know we need to wind up, but that is an insight that I think has been brought about by the debate.
Folks, I should have left more times for questions from the audience. I apologize, but we have run out of time. I do appreciate you being here. I certainly thank these panelists. Rachel, Senator, y'all did a great job. And this concludes our program. Thank you very much.